The following is an English translation of the original French article on freedom, from the Encyclopedie, the product of the French Enlightenment, led by Denis Diderot. This particular article was written by Jacques-André Naigeon in 1765. Freedom. Freedom resides in the power of an intelligent being to do what he wishes, according to his own determination. It cannot be said in a proper sense that this faculty occurs in the judgments we make about truths with respect to those that are evident. They compel our agreement and leave us no freedom at all. All that depends on us is to apply our mind to it or to depart from it. But once it is less obvious, freedom reclaims its rights, which vary and are set by the degree of clarity or obscurity. Good and evil are its principal objects, yet it does not extend to general notions of good and evil. Nature made us in such a way that we could only tend towards the good and shrink from evil considered in general. But when it comes down to details, our freedom has a vast purview and can determine us in many different directions, depending on circumstances and motives. Many proofs are invoked to show that freedom is a real prerogative of man, but they are not all equally strong. Monsieur Turretin relates 12 of them. Here is the list. 1. Our own sense that provides us with the conviction of freedom. 2. Without freedom, men would be pure automata, who would follow the impulse of causes like a watch, which obeys the movements which the watchmaker instilled in it. 3. The notions of virtue and vice, praise and blame, which are natural to us, would be without meaning. 4. A favour would no longer be more worthy of thanks than the fire that warms us. 5. Everything becomes necessary or impossible. What did not happen could not happen. Thus all projects are useless. All the rules of prudence are false, since in all things the end and the means are determined with equal necessity. 6. What is the source of the remorse of conscience? And what have I to reproach myself for if I have done something I could not avoid doing? 7. What is a poet, a historian, a conqueror, a wise legislator? They are men who could not do otherwise than what they have done. 8. Why punish criminals and reward good people? The worst thugs are innocent victims whom we sacrifice if there is no freedom. 9. To whom can we attribute the cause of sin if not to God? What becomes of religion with all its duties? 10. To whom does God give laws, make promises and threats, and prepare punishments and rewards? To pure machines incapable of choices. 11. If there is no freedom, why do we have a concept of it? It is strange that necessary causes should have led us to doubt their own necessity. 12. Finally, fatalists would be unable to take offence at anything said or done to them. To treat this subject precisely, we must give an idea of the principal systems that relate to it. The first system of freedom is that of fatality. Those who believe in it do not attribute our acts to our thoughts, in which alone persuasion resides, but to a mechanical cause that compels the determination of the will, so we do not act because we want to, but we want to because we act. That is the true distinction between freedom and fatality. It is precisely the one which the Stoics used to recognize and which Muslims still believe in today. Thus, the Stoics thought that everything happens through a blind fatality, that events follow one another and nothing can change the firm bond they form among themselves. Finally, that man is not free. Freedom, they say, is an illusion that is all the more flattering in that pride lends itself fully to it. It consists of a rather sensitive point, in that we bear witness to ourselves of our actions and do not know the motives which have led to them. Hence, unaware of the motives, and unable to combine all the circumstances that have determined us to act in a certain way. Each man prides himself on his actions and takes credit for them. The fatum of the Turks comes from their opinion that everything is awash in heavenly influences, and that they determine the future disposition of events. The Essenes had such a lofty and decisive notion of providence that they believed everything occurs through an inevitable fatality, and following the order which that providence has established and which never changes. There is no choice in their system, no freedom. All events form a tight and unalterable chain. Take away one of those events, and the chain is broken, and the whole economy of the world is troubled. One thing must be noted here. The doctrine that destroys freedom naturally inclines to sensuality, and anyone who considers only his taste, his pride, and his penchants finds reason enough to follow it and approve of it. Yet there was no evidence in Essenian or Stoic morality of the disorder of their minds. Spinoza, Hobbes, and several others have in our time believed in a similar fatality. Spinoza spread this error in several of his works. The example by which he purports to illuminate the matter of freedom will suffice to convince us of that. Imagine, he says, that a stone, while continuing to move, thinks and knows that it is striving with all its might to continue its motion. This stone, by the very fact that it feels the effort it makes to move, and that it is in no way indecisive between motion and immobility, will believe it is quite free, and continues to move solely because it wants to. And there you have that much-touted freedom, which consists solely in the awareness men have of their own appetites, and in their ignorance of the causes of their determinations. Spinoza not only strips creatures of their freedom, he further subjects his God to a crude and fatal necessity. That is the great foundation of his system. From this principle it follows that it is impossible that anything that does not presently exist could have existed, and that everything which does exist exists so necessarily that it could not be otherwise. And finally, that even manners of being and the circumstances of the existence of things had to be in every respect precisely what they are today. Spinoza expressly concedes these consequences and has no difficulty admitting that they follow naturally from his principles. We can reduce all these arguments used by Spinoza and his disciples to support this absurd hypothesis to these two. They say first, that since every effect presupposes a cause, and since, just as every motion that occurs in a body is caused in it by the impulsion of another body, and the motion in this second one by the impulsion of a third, and in that way every volition and every determination of man's will must be produced by some exterior cause, and it by a third, whence they conclude that freedom of the will is but an illusion. In the second place, they say that thought with all its modes are but qualities of matter, and consequently there is no freedom of the will, since it is evident that matter has not in itself the power of initiating motion or imparting the least determination to itself. In the third place, they add that what we are in the moment that will follow depends so necessarily on what we are at the present moment, that it is metaphysically impossible for us to be other than we are. For, they continue, let us suppose a woman who is impelled by her passion to throw herself promptly into her lover's arms. If we imagine 100,000 women exactly like the first in age, temperament, education, organization, and thought, such, in a word, that there is no discernible difference between them and the first one, we see them all equally subjected to their dominant passion and precipitated into their lover's arms, unable to conceive any reason why one of them would not do what all the others will do. We do nothing that can be called good or evil without a reason, but there is no reason that we control, with respect either to its production or its energy. To contend that there is an activity that is specific to the soul, 7, is to state something unintelligible, and one which resolves nothing. For there will always have to be a cause independent of the soul that determines such activity for one thing rather than another. And to return to the first part of the argument, what we are in the next moment depends absolutely on what we are in the present moment. What we are in the present moment thus depends on what we were in the preceding moment, and so forth, going back to the first moment of our existence, if there is one. Our life is therefore but a continuum of necessary existences and acts. Our will, an acquiescence in being what we necessarily are in each of those moments, and our freedom an illusion, either there is nothing proven in any domain, or that one is proven, But what above all confirms this system is the moment of deliberation, the case of irresolution. What do we do when we are undecided? It is as if our understanding is then the creator and observer of the necessity of our indecisions. Suppress all the motives that stir us, then necessary inertia and rest. Suppose a single unique motive, then necessary action. Suppose two or more concurrent motives, same necessity and more rapidity in the action. Suppose two or more contrary motives of roughly equal strength, then oscillations comparable to those of the arms of a balance set in motion and lasting until the more powerful one stabilizes the situation of the balance and the soul. 8. And how could the weaker motive prove to be the determining motive? That would be to say that it is at once the weaker and the stronger one. There is no difference between the man-automaton who acts in his sleep and the intelligent man who acts when awake, except that the understanding is more present in what occurs. As far as necessity is concerned, it is the same. But they are asked, what is this inner sense of our freedom, the illusion of a child who thinks nothing through? Is man then no different from an automaton? No different from a sentient automaton? Is he a more complex machine? Then can no man be evil or virtuous? No, if you like. But there are well and ill-endowed, good and bad beings. What of rewards and punishments? We need to banish those words from morality. We do not reward, but we encourage good behavior. We do not punish, but we smother, we frighten. Then what good do the laws do, and good examples and exhortations? They are all the more useful in that they necessarily have their effects. But why do you distinguish through your indignation and wrath between the just man who offends you and the roof tile that injures you? It is because I am unreasonable, and because I am then like the dog that bites the stone he was struck by. But where did we get this notion of freedom we have? From the same source as countless other false notions we have. In a word, they conclude, don't get upset at the wrong time. This system that seems so dangerous to you is not. It changes nothing about the good order of society. The things that corrupt men will always need suppressing. The things that improve them will always need multiplying and reinforcing. This is a dispute of idle persons and doesn't call for the slightest repression on the part of the legislator. Only our system of necessity assures to every cause that is good or in conformity with the established order its good effect, to every cause that is bad or contrary to the established order its bad effect, and by preaching indulgence and commiseration for those who are ill-endowed, it keeps us from being so vain at being unlike them. This is a matter of luck, which was in no way our own doing. In the fourth place, they ask whether a man is a wholly spiritual or wholly corporal being or a composite being. In the first two cases, they have no trouble proving the necessity of his actions. And if we answer them that he is a being composed of two principles, one material and the other immaterial, this is the way they reason. The spiritual principle is either always dependent on that immaterial principle or always independent. If it is always dependent, necessity is as absolute as if the being were one, single and entirely material, which is true. But if you tell them that it is sometimes dependent and sometimes independent, if you tell them that the thoughts of people who are feverish and of madmen are not free, whereas they are so in people who are healthy, they reply that there is neither uniformity nor coherence in our system, and that we make the two principles independent according to whether we need that supposition to defend ourselves, and not according to the truth of the matter. If a madman is not free, a wise man is not more so, and to maintain the opposite is to pretend that a weight of 6 pounds can fail to overbalance a weight of 5. But if a weight of 5 pounds can fail to be overbalanced by a weight of 6, it will not happen with a weight of 1,000, for then it is resisting a weight of 6 pounds by a principle independent of its weight. And that principle, whatever it is, will no more be proportionate to a weight of 1,000 pounds than one of 6, because it must be of a nature different from weight. 9. These are certainly the strongest arguments that can be made against our opinion. In order to expose their vanity, I shall refute them with the following 3 propositions. The first is that it is not true that every effect is the product of some external cause, that on the contrary one must imperatively recognize an initiation of action, in other words, a power of acting independently of any previous action, and that this power can be, and indeed is, possessed by man. My second proposition is that thought and will are not and cannot be qualities of matter. The third, finally, that even were the soul not a substance distinct from the body, one supposed that thought and will are only qualities of matter, even that would not prove that freedom of will was something impossible. 10th, I say first that no effect can be produced by external causes, but that it is absolutely necessary to recognize an initiation of action, in other words, an ability to act independently of any antecedent action, and that this power is present in man. This has already been proven in the article cooperation. I say, secondly, that thought and will, not being qualities of matter, consequently cannot be subject to its laws. For whatever is made or composed of a thing is still that same thing of which it is composed. For example, all the possible changes, compositions and divisions of the figure are nothing other than a figure, and all the possible compositions and effects of motion will never be anything but motion. Thus, if there was a time when nothing existed in the world but matter and motion, we would have to say that it is impossible there ever could have been anything in the world other than matter and motion. In that case, it is as impossible for intelligence, reflection, and all the various sensations ever to have begun to exist, as it is now impossible for motion to be blue or red, or for the triangle to be transformed into a sound. 11. See the article on the soul, where this has been more extensively proven. But even if I granted Spinoza and Hobbes that thought and will be, and indeed are qualities of matter, that would not decide in their favour the present question about freedom, and would not prove that free will was something impossible. For since we have already shown that thought and will not be productions of figure and motion, it is clear that any man who supposes that thought and will are qualities of matter must also suppose that matter is capable of certain properties entirely different from figure and motion. Now, if matter is capable of such properties, how is one to prove that the effects of figure and motion all being necessary, the effects of the other properties of matter that are entirely distinct from them must comparably be necessary? It hence appears that the argument that Hobbes and his disciples use as their great shield is nothing more than a pure sophism, for they suppose on the one hand that matter is capable of thought and will, from which they conclude that the soul is purely material. Knowing on the other hand that the effects of figure and motion must all be necessary, they conclude therefrom that all the operations of the soul are necessary. In other words, when it comes to proving that the soul is purely material, they suppose matter capable not only of figure and motion, but also of other unknown properties. Contrariwise, when it comes to proving that will and the other operations of the soul are necessary things, they strip matter of these supposedly unknown properties and reduce it to a pure solid composed of figure and motion. 12. Having satisfied a few objections that are made against freedom, let us in our turn take on the partisans of blind fatality. Freedom shines with its full light, whether we consider it in the mind or examine it in relation to the sway it exercises over the body. And first of all, when I want to think about something such as the power of the magnet to attract iron, 13, is it not certain that I apply my soul to contemplating this question whenever I so desire, and that I leave it aside when I wish to? It would be shamefully disputatious to doubt it. All that remains is to find its cause. We see, first, that the object is not right in front of me. I have neither iron nor a magnet, so it is not the object that makes me think about it. I am aware that once we have seen something, there remain traces in the brain that facilitate the determination of the spirits. 14. Hence it can sometimes occur that those spirits flow by themselves into those traces without our knowing why, or even an object that has some relation with the one they represent can have prodded them and awaked them to act. Then the object comes to mind on its own. Likewise, when the animal spirits are moved by some strong passion, the object appears despite us, and whatever we do, it occupies our thought. All these things happen. We do not deny it. But that is not the issue. Aside from all those reasons that can elicit such a thought in my mind, I feel that I have the power to produce it any time I wish to. I am thinking at this moment about why the magnet attracts iron. In a moment, if I so wish, I will cease to think about that and will occupy my mind contemplating the ebb and flow of the sea. From that I will pass on, if I wish, to looking for the cause of gravity. After that, I shall recall, if I want to, the thought of the magnet, and hold on to it as long as I want. One cannot act more freely. Not only do I possess this power, but I sense and realize that I possess it. Therefore, since it is a truth that is experienced, known, and felt, it ought rather to be considered an incontestable fact than a question to be debated. There is therefore indubitably within me a principle, a superior cause, that rules my thoughts, that initiates them, dismisses them, and recalls them in an instant at its command. And consequently there is in man a free spirit that acts upon itself as it wishes. With respect to the operations of the body, the absolute power of the will is no less palpable. I want to move my arm, and at once it moves. I want to speak, and I immediately speak, etc. We have an inner persuasion of all these truths. No one denies them. 16. Nothing on earth can diminish them. One can neither give nor think up a notion of freedom, however great and independent, which I do not experience and recognize in myself in this respect. It is foolish to say that I think I am free, because I am capable of and subject to several determinations occasioned by various movements unknown to me, for I know I am aware, and I feel that the determinations that make me speak or hold my peace are dependent on my will. Thus we are free not merely in the sense that we have awareness of our movements and feel neither force nor constraint. On the contrary, we feel that we possess in ourselves the master of the machine that drives all the springs the way it wishes. Despite all the reasons and all the determinations that incline and urge me to walk, I feel and am persuaded that my will can, as it wishes, halt and suspend at every moment the effect of those hidden springs that make me act. If I acted only by those hidden springs, by the impressions of objects, I must necessarily fulfill all the motions they would be capable of producing, just as a billiard ball that is impacted completes on the billiard table the motion it has absorbed. 17. We could attest to several occasions in human life when the sway of that freedom is exercised with such power that it tames the body and violently represses all its movements. In the exercise of virtue, where one must resist a strong passion, all the body's movements are determined by passion, but the will opposes and represses them for the sole reason of duty. 18. On the other hand, when we reflect on the number of people who have taken their lives without being forced to it, either by madness or by fury, etc., but solely by the vanity of being talked about or showing the power of their minds, etc., we must necessarily recognize that the power of freedom is stronger than all the movements of nature. What power does not have to be brought to bear over this body in order to force the hand to take up a dagger in cold blood to drive it into one's own heart? 19. One of the finest minds of this century tried to test the length to which such a paradox could be sustained. His free-thinking imagination dared to take on a subject as respectable as freedom. Here is the objection in all its force. 20. Whatever is dependent on something has certain proportions with that very thing. In other words, it absorbs changes when that thing does in keeping with the nature of their proportion. Whatever is independent of something has no proportion with it, so the one remains unaffected when the other receives augmentations and diminutions. I suppose he goes on to say, with all metaphysicians, 1, that the soul thinks as the brain is disposed, and that certain material dispositions of the brain and certain movements that occur there are answered by certain thoughts of the soul. 2, that all the objects, even spiritual, about which one thinks leave material dispositions, in other words, traces in the brain. 3, I further suppose a brain in which there are at the same time 2 sorts of material dispositions, opposite and of equal strength, the ones which urge the soul to think virtuously about a subject, the others which urge it to think wickedly. This supposition cannot be rejected. Opposite material dispositions can easily occur together in the brain to the same degree, and necessarily occur together every time a soul deliberates, uncertain what to choose. With that assumption, I say, either that the soul can absolutely determine itself in that equilibrium of the brain's dispositions to choose between virtuous and wicked thoughts, or it absolutely cannot determine itself in that equilibrium. If it can determine itself, it possesses in itself the power of self-determination, since in its brain everything tends only to indetermination, and yet it determines itself. Therefore, this power that it possesses to determine itself is independent of the dispositions of the brain. Therefore, it has no proportion with them. Therefore, it remains unchanged, even though they change. Therefore, if the equilibrium of the brain subsists, the soul determines itself to think virtuously. It will nonetheless possess the power to determine itself, even if it is the material disposition to think wickedly that overbalances the other one. Therefore, to whatever height this material disposition to wicked thoughts may climb, the soul will possess nonetheless the power to determine itself to choose virtuous thoughts. Therefore, the soul possesses in itself the power of self-determination, despite all the contrary dispositions of the brain. Therefore, the thoughts of the soul are always free. We come now to the second case. If the soul can absolutely not determine itself, that comes only from the supposed equilibrium in the brain, and we understand that it will never determine itself if one of the dispositions does not overbalance the other, and will necessarily determine itself for the one that overbalances. Therefore, the power it has to determine itself for the choice of virtuous or wicked thoughts is absolutely dependent on the dispositions of the brain. Therefore, better stated, the soul possesses in itself no power of self-determination, and it is the dispositions of the brain that determine it for vice or virtue. Therefore, the thoughts of the soul are never free. Now, combining these 2 cases, either it happens that the thoughts of the soul are always free, or that they never are in any case. Now it is true and recognized by all that the thoughts of children, of those who dream, of the feverish and of madmen, are never free. It is easy to recognize the crux of this argument. It establishes a uniform principle in the soul, such that the principle is always either independent of the dispositions of the brain or always dependent, whereas in the opinion of most it is assumed to be sometimes dependent and at other times independent. It is said that the thoughts of the feverish and madmen are not free because the material dispositions of the brain are attenuated and raised to such a pitch that the soul cannot hold against them, whereas in the healthy, the dispositions of the brain are moderate and do not necessarily subjugate the soul. But one in this system, the principle not being uniform, it must be abandoned if I can explain everything in one that is. 2. If, as we said earlier, it was possible for a weight of 5 pounds not to be overbalanced by a weight of 6, neither would it be overbalanced by a weight of 1,000. For if it could resist a weight of 6 pounds by a principle independent of gravity, that principle, whatever it be of a wholly different nature from that of weights, would have no more proportion with a weight of 1,000 pounds than with one of 6. Thus, if the soul resists a material disposition of the brain that inclines it toward a wicked choice, and which, though moderate, is yet stronger than the material disposition toward virtue, then the soul must resist that same material disposition of vice were it infinitely greater than the other, because it could have resisted it at first only by a principle independent of the dispositions of the brain, and which must not change by the dispositions of the brain. 3. If the brain could see very clearly, despite a disposition of the eye that ought to weaken sight, we could conclude that it would still see despite a disposition of the eye that would entirely prevent vision insofar as it is material. 4. We agree that the soul depends absolutely on the dispositions of the brain with respect to the quantity of spirit. 21. However, with respect to virtue or vice, the dispositions of the brain determine the soul only when they are extreme, and leave it its freedom only when they are moderate, so that one can have much virtue despite a mediocre disposition toward vice. It should also be true that one can have much spirit despite a mediocre disposition toward dullness, and that we cannot allow. It is true that work increases the spirit, or to put it better, that it fortifies the dispositions of the brain, and that thus spirit increases precisely as much as the brain improves. In the 5th place, I suppose that the whole difference there is between a brain awake and a brain asleep, is that a sleeping brain has less abundant spirits, and that the nerves there are less flexed, in such a way that movements are not communicated from one nerve to another, and that the spirits that reopen one trace do not reopen another one that is linked to it. That granted, if the soul is able to resist the dispositions of the brain when they are feeble, it is still free in its dreams, whereas the dispositions of the brain that incline it to certain things are always quite feeble. If we say that is because it is presented only with one sort of thought that offers no material for deliberation. I take a dream in which one deliberates over whether or not to kill one's friend, which can only be produced by contrary material dispositions in the brain. In this case, it appears that, according to the principles of common opinion, the soul ought to be free. I am supposing that one awakens having decided to kill his friend, and that once awake he no longer wants to kill him. The only thing that happens in the brain is that it fills up with spirits and the nerves are flexed. We must see how that produces freedom. The material disposition of the brain that inclined me in a dream to kill my friend was stronger than the other. I say, either the change that occurs in my brain strengthens both, and they remain in the same disposition as before, one remaining, for example, 3 times stronger than the other. And you could not imagine why the soul is free when one of these dispositions has 10 degrees of force and the other 30, and why it is not free when one of these dispositions has but 1 degree of force and the other 3. If this change in the brain has strengthened only one of these dispositions, then to establish freedom it must be the one against which I am determining myself, in other words, the one that inclined me to kill my friend. And then you would never be able to understand why the force that this vicious disposition acquires is necessary in order for me to determine myself in favor of the virtuous disposition that remains the same. This change appears rather an obstacle to freedom. Finally, if it strengthens one disposition more than the other, again it must be the vicious disposition. Nor would you ever understand why the force it acquires is necessary in order to cause the other one, which is still the feebler, though stronger than before, to be embraced. If one says that what prevents the soul's freedom during sleep is that thoughts do not come to it with enough clarity and distinction, I reply that the lack of clarity and distinction in the thoughts can only prevent the soul from determining itself with enough awareness, but cannot prevent it from determining itself freely, and cannot take away the freedom, but only the merit or blame for the resolution it takes. Because of the obscurity and confusion of the thoughts, the soul knows too little of which it is deliberating, but it does not cause the soul to be necessarily induced into one choice. Otherwise, if the soul were necessarily induced, it would no doubt be by the least obscure and muddled of one's obscure and muddled ideas. And I would ask why the clearest and most distinct of the thoughts would necessarily determine it during one's sleep, and not when one is awake, and I would bring back all the arguments I have made on material dispositions. Now let us return to the objection by parts. First, I grant the three principles that the objection poses. That assumed, let us see what argument can be made against freedom. Either the soul, they tell us, can absolutely determine itself in the equilibrium of the brain's dispositions to choose between virtuous and wicked thoughts, or it cannot determine itself absolutely in this equilibrium. If it can determine itself, it has in itself the power of self-determination. Up to this point there is no difficulty, but to conclude therefrom that the power of the soul to determine itself is independent of the dispositions of the brain, that is what is not exactly true. If what you mean by that is not what is generally understood, which is that freedom does not reside in the body, but only that the soul is its seat, source, and origin, I will have no dispute with you over that. But if you want to infer from it that whatever the material dispositions of the brain, the soul will always have the power to determine itself for whatever choice it wishes, that is what I will deny. The reason for this is that for the soul to determine itself freely, it must necessarily exercise all those functions, and in order to exercise them it needs a body ready to obey all its commands, just as a lute player must have a lute with all its strings taut and tuned in order to play songs accurately. 23. Now it may very well be that the material dispositions of the brain are such that the soul cannot exercise all its functions, nor consequently its freedom, for freedom consists in the power one has to fixate one's ideas, to recall others so as to compare them, to direct the movement of all one's spirits, to fix them in the state they must be in to prevent an idea from escaping, to stand against the torrent of other spirits that could come and create an impediment to impress other ideas on the soul. Now the brain is sometimes disposed of in a way that this power is absolutely wanting in the soul, as we see in children, dreamers, etc. Supposing an ill-constructed vessel and a defective rudder, the pilot, with all his art, will be unable to steer it as he wishes. In the same way, an ill-formed body or a depraved temperament will produce chaotic acts. The human mind will be no more able to remedy such chaos and correct it than a pilot the disorder of his vessel's movement. But after all, you will say, is the soul's power of self-determination absolutely dependent on the dispositions of the brain or not? If you say that this power of the soul is absolutely dependent on the dispositions of the brain, you will also say that the soul will never determine itself unless one of those dispositions of the brain manages to overbalance the other, and it will necessarily determine itself for the one that prevails. If, on the contrary, you suppose this power is independent of the dispositions of the brain, you must recognize the thoughts of children, dreamers, etc., as free. I reply that the soul's power of self-determination is sometimes dependent on the dispositions of the brain, and at other times independent. It is dependent every time the brain, which serves the soul as the organ and instrument for the exercise of its functions, is not properly disposed of. Then, the springs of the machine being off track, the soul is overpowered and unable to exercise its freedom. But the power of self-determination is independent of the material dispositions of the brain when those dispositions are moderate. The brain is full of spirits, and the nerves are flexed. Freedom will be all the more complete as the organ of the brain is better constituted and its dispositions more moderate. I am unable to specify the limits beyond which freedom disappears. All I know is that the power of self-determination will be absolutely independent of the dispositions of the brain whenever the brain is full of spirits, when its fibers are firm, when they are flexed, and the springs of the machine are not unwound by either accidents or illnesses. The principle, you say, is not uniform in the soul. It is much more consonant with philosophy to suppose the soul is either always free or always a slave, and I say that experience is the only true physics. Now what does this experience tell us? It tells us that we are sometimes overpowered despite ourselves. whence I conclude that we are therefore sometimes our own masters. Illness proves health, and freedom proves the health of the soul. See this argument adorned and embellished by Monsieur de Voltaire with all the graces of poetry in the second discourse on freedom. Thou sayest thou art sometimes deprived of thy freedom. Should God have given it to thee changeless, infinite, the same in every state, time, and place? Thy destinies are a man's, and thy wishes a God's. In this ocean shall this swimming atom say, Immensity should be my share. No, all is weak in thee, changing and limited. Thy strength, thy spirit, thy members, thy beauty. Nature has prescribed limits to every sense, and human power alone should be without limits. But tell me, when thy heart, shaped by passions, yields despite itself to their impressions, when it feels in its struggles its freedom defeated, thou hadst it then in thyself, since thou hast lost it. A burning fever attacking thy fibres, by halts and starts undermines thy feeble body. What then? By this danger unleashed on thy life, thy health is not forever destroyed. Thou returnest from the gates of death, firmer, more contented, more temperate and strong. No better the happy gift for which thine illness calls. Freedom in man is the health of the soul. It is sometimes lost. The thirst for greatness, anger, pride, a seductive love, the deceitful fantasies of a curious desire. Alas, how many maladies hath the heart? 25. If a weight of 5 pounds, you say, could fail to be overbalanced by a weight of 6, neither would it be by a weight of 1,000. Thus, if the soul resists a material disposition of the brain that inclines it to a wicked choice, and which, though moderate, is stronger than the material disposition to virtue, the soul must resist that same material disposition of vice, even if it were infinitely greater than the other. 26. I reply that it in no way follows that the soul can resist a material disposition of vice, even if it were infinitely greater than the material disposition toward virtue, precisely because it was able to resist that same material disposition of vice when it was a little greater than the other. When, of two opposite dispositions that are in the brain, one is infinitely stronger than the other, it may occur that in this state the natural movement of the spirits is too violent, and as a result the force of the soul may no proportion with that of those spirits that necessarily prevail. Although the principle by which I determine myself is independent of the dispositions of the brain, since it resides in my soul, one can nonetheless say that it presupposes them as a condition without which it would become redundant. The power of self-determination is not more dependent on the dispositions of the brain than the power to paint, engrave, and write, the art of the brush, the burin, or the pen. And just as one cannot write, engrave, and paint well if one does not have a good pen, a good burin, and a brush, so one cannot act freely unless the brain is properly constituted. But also as the power to write, engrave, and paint is absolutely independent of the pen, burin, and brush, the power of self-determination is no less independent of the brain. We agree, you will say, that the soul depends absolutely on the dispositions of the brain with respect to the degree of presence of mind. 27th. Yet over virtue and vice the dispositions of the brain determine the soul only when they are extreme, and they leave it its freedom when they are moderate. So one can have much virtue despite a modest disposition to vice. It should also be the case that one can have much presence of mind despite a modest disposition to dullness. I admit that I am not very sensitive to the astuteness of this argument. I cannot conceive why, if capable of much virtue despite a modest disposition to vice, I could also have much presence of mind despite a modest disposition to dullness. The degree of awareness depends on the degree of delicacy of the organs. It consists of a certain configuration of the brain and a fortunate disposition of the fibres. All these things being in no way subject to the choice of my will, it is not in my power to put myself in a state to have, if I so wish, great discernment and penetration. But virtue and vice are dependent on my will. Yet I will not deny that the temperament has much to do with it, and ordinarily one has more confidence in a virtue that is natural and comes from the blood than one that is a pure effect of reason. and which one has acquired by dint of effort. I am supposing they go on that one awakens, having resolved to kill one's friend, and that once awake one no longer wants to kill him. The brain's material disposition that inclined me while dreaming to want to kill my friend was stronger than the other. I say, either the change taking place in my brain strengthens both equally, or they remain in the same disposition they were before, the one still being, for example, 3 times stronger than the other. You could conceive why the soul is free when one of these dispositions has 10 degrees of force and the other 30, and is not free when one of these dispositions has but 1 degree of force and the other but 3. If this objection has any force, it is only because one does not distinguish exactly enough the differences there are between the waking and sleeping states. If I am not free while asleep, it is not, as the objection supposes, because the brain's material disposition which inclines me to kill my friend is 3 times stronger than the other one. The absence of freedom comes from the absence of spirit and the slackening of the nerves, but once the brain is full of spirits and the nerves flexed, I will always be equally free, whether one of these dispositions has 10 degrees of force and the other 30, or one of these dispositions has but 1 degree of force and the other but 3. If you want to know the reason, it is that the power of self-determination which is in the soul is absolutely independent of the brain's dispositions, provided the brain is well constituted, that it be full of spirits and the nerves flexed. The action of the spirits depends on 3 things: the nature of the brain on which they act, their particular nature, and the quantity or the determination of their movement. Of these 3 things, it is precisely only the last which the soul may master. Therefore the sole power to move the spirits must suffice for freedom. But you say, 1. If the power to direct the movement of spirits suffices for freedom, then children must be free, since their soul must possess that power. 2. Why would the soul of madmen not be free as well? It can still direct the movement of its spirits. 3. The soul should never have more facility in directing the movement of its spirits than during sleep, and consequently it ought never to be more free. My answer is that the power of directing the movement of one's spirits is found neither in children nor in madmen nor in those who sleep. The nature of children's brains is opposed to it. Their substance is too tender and too soft. Their fibres are too delicate to allow their soul to fixate on and halt at will the spirits that must flow on all sides, because they find a free and easy passage throughout. In madmen, the natural movement of their spirits is too violent for their soul to master them. In that state, the force of the soul has no proportion with that of the spirits that necessarily overbalance it. Finally, sleep having distended the body's machine and cushioned all movements, the spirits cannot flow freely. To want the soul in this state of numbness, where all the senses are bound up and all its springs relaxed, to direct at its will the movements of its spirits, is to require a lyre player to make a lyre sing under his bow with loose strings. One of the most devastating arguments ever made against freedom is the impossibility of reconciling it with the foreknowledge of God. 30. There have been philosophers determined enough to say that God can very well be unaware of the future, more or less, if we can so speak, as a king can be unaware of what a general does to whom he has given carte blanche. That is the opinion of the Socinians. 31. Others maintain that the argument taken from the certainty of divine foreknowledge does not affect the question of freedom, because foreknowledge, they say, entails no other certainty than would be found equally in things if there were no foreknowledge. All that exists today exists certainly, and it was yesterday, and from all eternity as certainly true that it would exist today as it is now that it exists. This certainty of an event is ever the same. 32. And foreknowledge makes no difference. It is, with relation to things future, what awareness is to things present and memory to things past. Now both of these awarenesses suppose no necessity of existence in the thing, but only a certainty of event that would not fail to be, even if these awarenesses were absent. 33. So far, this is all intelligible. The difficulty is and always will be to explain how God can foresee things future, which could only be possible by supposing a chain of necessary causes. We can nevertheless manage some sort of general idea of it. A clever man foresees the decision a man will make in a certain situation when he knows his character. A fortiori God, whose nature is infinitely more perfect, can by foresight have a much more certain understanding of free events. I admit that all this seems to me very contingent, and that it is an avowal rather than a solution to the difficulty. I further admit that there are excellent objections made against freedom, but ones just as good are made against the existence of God. And inasmuch as, despite the extreme difficulties against creation and against providence, I believe none the less in providence and creation, so I believe myself free, despite the powerful objections that will always be made against this beleaguered freedom. How could I not believe in it? It bears all the marks of a first truth. Never was any opinion so universal among humankind. It is a truth for the clarification of which it is not necessary to pursue the arguments of books. It is what nature cries out. It is what shepherds sing on the mountains forth, and poets on the stage. It is what the ablest theologians teach in the pulpits. It is what is repeated and assumed in all the conjunctures of life. Do the small number of those who, by an affectation of singularity or by abusive reflections, have tried to say or imagine the contrary, not themselves reveal by their conduct the falseness of their assertions? Give me, says the illustrious Fenelon, a man who plays the profound philosopher and denies freedom. I will not argue against him, but I shall put him to the test in the commonest occasions of life to confound himself. Supposing that this man's wife is unfaithful to him, that his son disobeys and scorns him, that his friend betrays him and his servant robs him, I will say to him when he complains of them, do you not know that none of them has done wrong, that they are not free to do otherwise? They are, by your admission, as invincibly forced to want what they want as a stone is to fall if no one supports it. 35. Is it then not certain that this strange philosopher who dares to deny free will in school will assume it as indubitable in his own house, and that he will not be less implacable against these persons than if he had maintained the greatest freedom his whole life long? See the mischievous enemy of freedom, the blind partisan of a blind fatality. Hear how he consults, approves, or deliberates. Hear how he rebukes his adversary. See how he seeks vengeance on an adversary, how he punishes his son and tries to correct him. Did he think he was free? Doubtless, and he himself betrays his baleful system at every step. He deceived his heart by trying to explain the doctrine is absurd to believe and absurd to practice. He recognizes in him the opinion he defies. He acts as if free and speaks like a slave. Monsieur Voltaire, Second Discourse on Freedom, 36. Mr. Bayle has in particular made every effort to destroy the argument taken from the strong sense we have of our freedom. Here are his reasons. Let us also say that the clear and distinct sense we have of the acts of our will cannot make us discern whether we give them to ourselves or receive them from the same cause that gives us existence. We must have recourse to reflection to make this discernment. Now I assert that through purely philosophical meditations we can never reach a well-founded certainty that we are the efficient cause of our volitions. For any person who examines things carefully will evidently realize that if we were only a purely passive subject with respect to the will, we would have the same senses of experience that we have when we think we are free. Allow yourself to suppose that God has so contrived the laws of the union of the soul and body that all modalities of the soul are necessarily linked among themselves with the interposition of the modalities of the brain. You will understand that what happens to you will be just what we experience. There will be in our soul the same sequence of thoughts, beginning with the perception of the objects of the senses, which is the first step, up to the most unchanging volitions, which are the last. There will be in this sequence the sense of ideas, that of affirmations, that of irresolutions, that of reminiscences, and that of volitions. For whether the act of willing is impressed on us by a cause from without, or we produce it ourselves, it will be equally true that we will, and that we sense what we will. And as this cause from without can mix as much pleasure as it wants into the volition it impresses on us, we could sometimes sense that the acts of our will are infinitely pleasurable. Do you not clearly understand that a weather vane on which one always impressed at once the same movement towards a certain point on the horizon, and the desire to turn itself in that direction, would be persuaded that it moved of its own volition to carry out the desires it conceived? I suppose it would not know that winds existed, nor that a cause from without brought change at the same time in its situation and in its desires. There we are naturally in this state, etc. All of Mr. Bayle's arguments are very fine, but it is a shame they are not persuasive. They confound ours, and yet I do not know that they make any impression on us. Well, I could say to Mr. Bayle, you say I am not free. Your own sentiment cannot force you to admit that. According to you, it is not quite clear whether it is a pure choice and an act of my will to move my hand or not. If that is so, it is therefore necessarily determined that in 15 minutes I will raise my hand 3 times in a row, or that I shall not thus raise it 3 times. Can I then make no change in this necessary determination? That supposed, should I bet on one side rather than the other, I can win only on one side. If it is seriously that you contend I am not free, you will never be able to refuse sensibly an offer I am about to make you. It is that I bet 1,000 pistoles against your one that I will do, concerning the movement of my hand. Exactly the opposite of what you wager. And I will let you take as you wish one side or the other. Is there a more advantageous offer? Why then will you never accept the wager without passing for a madman, and perhaps indeed being mad? For if you do not deem it advantageous, what can be the source of that judgment, if not from the one you necessarily and invincibly form, that I am free? So it would be up to me to make you lose at this game not only the 1,000 pistoles the first time we wagered, but again as many times as we repeated the wager. To the proofs of reason and sentiment we could add those that are furnished to us by morality and religion. Take away freedom and all of human nature is overturned, and there is no longer any trace of order in society. If men are not free in the good and evil they do, good is no longer good, and evil is no longer evil. If an inevitable and invincible necessity makes us want whatever we want, our will is no more responsible for what it wills than the spring of a machine is responsible for the movement that is impressed on it. In that case, it is foolish to accuse the will for it, which wants only in so far as another cause distinct from itself makes it do so. We must go straight back to that cause, as I go back to the hand that moves the switch, without stopping at the switch that only strikes me as much as that hand swings it. Once again, take away freedom, and you leave neither vice nor virtue nor merit on earth. Rewards are foolish and punishments unjust. No one does anything but what he must, since he acts according to necessity. He needs neither avoid what is inevitable, nor defeat what is invincible. Everything is in order, for the order is that everything ye yield necessity. The ruin of freedom overturns with it all order and all civilization, conflates vice and virtue, authorizes every monstrous infamy, extinguishes all modesty and all remorse, and irremediably degrades and disfigures all of humankind. Such a horrendous doctrine ought not to be examined in the school, but punished by judges. Without freedom, what then would our souls become? Movable bodies agitated by invincible flames, our desires, our actions, our pleasures, our displeasures of our being, in a word, nothing would be ours. Powerless machines of a supreme artisan, thinking automata moved by divine hands, we would be forever occupied by untruths, base instruments of a God who had deceived us. How without freedom could we be in his image? What would derive from his crude artifacts? We can then not please him, we cannot offend him. He has nothing to punish, nothing to reward. In the heavens, on earth, there is no more justice. Cato had no virtue, Catiline no vice. Destiny draws us into our awful penchants, and this chaos of the world is made for the wicked, the insolent oppressor, the greedy usurper, Cartouche, 40 Mivisis, 41, or some other barbarian. More guilty than they, the slanderer will say, I have done nothing, God alone did it. It is not me, it is he who breaks my promise, who strikes by my hands, pillages, burns, rapes. That is how the God of justice and of peace would be the author of turmoil and the God of crimes. Would the sorry partisans of this frightful dogma say anything more if they worship the devil? The second system with respect to freedom is that in which one maintains that the soul never determines itself without cause and without a reason from elsewhere than its own volition. Such is above all the favourite system of Mr. Leibniz. According to him, the cause of determination is not physical, it is moral, and acts on the intelligence itself, in such a way that a man can never be prompted to act freely except by means proper to persuade him. That is why laws are needed, and why punishments and rewards are necessary. Hope and fear act immediately on the intelligence. This freedom is the opposite of physical or fatal necessity, but not necessarily of moral necessity, which, provided it be alone, extends only to contingent things, and in no way infringes on freedom. Of this sort is that liberty which makes a man who has the use of his reason, if you offer him the choice between good food and poison, determine himself for the former. Freedom in this case is entire, and yet the opposite is impossible. Who can deny that the wise man, when he acts freely, necessarily follows the option that wisdom prescribes? Hypothetical necessity is not less compatible with freedom. All those who have regarded it as destructive of freedom have confused certainty and necessity. Certainty only asserts that an event will take place rather than its opposite, because the causes on which it depends are disposed to produce their effect. But necessity overbalances the cause itself by the absolute impossibility of its opposite. Now the determination of contingent futures, the basis of hypothetical necessity, results simply from the nature of truth. It does not affect the causes, and not destroying contingency, it could not be contrary to freedom. Let us listen to Mr. Leibniz. Hypothetical necessity is the necessity which the supposition or hypothesis of the foresight and preordination of God imposes on contingent futures. But neither that foreknowledge nor that preordination goes against freedom, for God, disposed by supreme reason to choose among several sequences of things or possible worlds, that one in which free creatures would take such and such decisions, though not without competition, has thereby made everything equally certain and determined once and for all, without thereby going against the freedom of those creatures, that simple decree of choice not changing, but merely actualizing their free natures, which he saw in his mind. 43. The third system with respect to freedom is that of those who pretend that man possesses freedom, which they call of indifference, which is to say that in the free determinations of the will, the soul does not choose in consequence of motives, but that it is not more inclined toward yes or no, and chooses solely by an effect of its activity, without there being any reason for its choice, except that it so willed. What is certain is that, 1, in God there is no freedom of equilibrium or indifference. A being such as God, who can conceive with the highest degree of precision the infinitely small differences of things, no doubt sees the good, the bad, and the better, and could only will in conformity with what he sees. For otherwise either he would act without reason or against reason, two equally offensive suppositions. Therefore God always follows the ideas which his infinite understanding shows him to be preferable to others. He chooses the best among several possible plans. He wills and does nothing except by sufficient reasons based on the nature of beings and on his divine attributes. 2. Nor do the blessed in heaven possess this freedom of equilibrium. Nothing good can weigh against God in their hearts. He ravishes at once all the love of the will, and makes every other good disappear as the light of day makes the shades of night disappear. The question is therefore whether man is free by the freedom of indifference or equilibrium. Here are the reasons of those who maintain the negative. 1. The thing seems impossible. It is a matter of choosing between A and B. You say that leaving everything aside, you can choose one or the other. You choose A. Why? Because I want to, you say, but why do you want A rather than B? You reply, because I want it. God gave me that faculty. But what does I want to will mean, or I want because I want? These words have no other meaning than this. I want A. But you have not yet answered my question. Why don't you want B? Are you rejecting it for no reason? If you say I like A because I like it, either that means nothing, or it should be understood to mean I like A because of some reason that makes me prefer it to B. Otherwise, nothingness would produce an effect, a consequence which the defenders of the freedom of equilibrium are obliged to digest. 2. This freedom is opposed to the principle of sufficient reason, for if we choose between two or several objects without there being a reason that inclines us towards one rather than another, that is a determination that occurs without any cause. The defenders of indifference reply that this determination does not occur without cause, since the soul itself, as active principle, is the efficient cause of all acts. That is true, but where does the determination of that act come from? The preference it is given over the opposite choice. To propose, says Mr. Leibniz, that a determination comes from a full, absolutely indeterminate indifference is to propose that it comes naturally from nowhere. It is supposed that God does not provide this determination. It has no source in the soul, nor in the body, nor in the circumstances, since all is supposed to be indeterminate, and yet there it is, appearing and existing without preparation, and God himself cannot see or make visible how it exists. 45. An effect cannot occur unless there is in the cause that is to produce it a disposition to act in the way required to produce that effect. Now a choice, an act of the will, is an effect the cause of which is the soul. It must therefore be disposed to make it rather than another one for us to make such a choice, whence it results that the soul is not indeterminate and indifferent. 3. The doctrine of perfect indifference destroys any notion of wisdom and virtue. If I choose one option, not because I find it in keeping with the laws of wisdom, but without any reason, true or false, good or bad, and uniquely by a blind impetuosity that determines itself at random, what praise can I deserve if it turns out that I have chosen well, since I did not make the choice because it was best, and could have done the opposite with the same ease? How can anyone credit me with wisdom if I do not determine myself by reasons? The behavior of a being endowed with such freedom would be exactly like that of a man who decided all his acts by a throw of the dice or by drawing straws. It would be vain to do research on the motives by which men act. It would be vain to propose laws, punishments, and rewards to them, if all of that has no effect on their will, indifferent to everything. 4. Freedom of indifference is incompatible with the nature of an intelligent being who, once he senses and knows himself, essentially loves his happiness, and consequently also loves everything he thinks can contribute to it. It is foolish to say that those objects are indifferent to such a being, and that, when he clearly understands that of two choices, one is advantageous to him and the other harmful, he can choose one just as easily as the other. Already he cannot approve the one and the other. To give his approbation as a last resort is the same thing as determining himself. That, then, is the determination that comes from reasons or motives. Moreover, we conceive in the will the effort to act, which even constitutes its essence and distinguishes it from simple judgment. Now, a spirit not being at all susceptible to a mechanical impulsion, what could incite him to act if it is not the love he has for himself and for his own happiness? That is the greatest motive for all spirits. Never do they act except when they desire to act. Now, what makes that desire efficacious, if not the pleasure one takes in satisfying it? And whence arises that desire, if it is not from the representation of the perception of the object? An intelligent being, therefore, can be prompted to act only by some motive, some reason taken from a real or apparent good, which he anticipates from his action. There is nothing reasonably solid in any of these arguments, however specious they appear, to which the defenders of freedom of indifference do not reply. Mr. King, Archbishop of Dublin, has maintained it in God himself in his book on the origin of evil, Fortuotis, but in saying that nothing is good or evil in God with relation to the creatures before his choice, he teaches a doctrine which will make justice arbitrary and conflate the nature of the just and the unjust. Monsieur Cruza pleads in his favour in most of his works. But there are philosophers who have gone about it differently to maintain indifference. First, they admit that such a freedom could not be appropriate to God, but, they continue, one must reason quite differently with respect to limited and subaltern intelligences. Restricted to a certain more or less large sphere of activity, their ideas only attain a certain level in the understanding of objects, and consequently they must on occasion take as equal things which are not at all equal. Here appearances have the same effect as reality, and we will not disagree that when it comes to judging, to self-determination, or to action, it matters little whether the things are equal or unequal, provided the impressions they make on us are the same. One can easily foresee that the antagonists on indifference will hasten to deny that equal impression can result from unequal objects. Yet there is nothing about that supposition that does not follow necessarily from the limitation that constitutes the creature's essential character. Once our intelligence is limited, that which differentiates objects must infallibly escape us, when it is of a kind that can be perceived only by an extremely steady and delicate vision. And what follows from that, if not that on numerous occasions the soul must find itself in a state of doubt and suspension, without knowing precisely how to determine its choice? That is also what is justified by frequent experience. These principles posited, it follows from them that freedom of equilibrium is less a prerogative in which we can glory than an imperfection in our nature and our knowledge which increases or decreases in inverse proportion to our insight. God, foreseeing that our soul, as a consequence of its imperfection, would often be irresolute, and as if suspended between two options, gave it the power of emerging from that suspension by a determination the principle of which was itself. That is not to suppose that nothing can produce something. Is it indeed to allege a nothing when we give the will as cause of our actions in certain cases? What would become of that activity which is the hallmark of intelligences, if the soul could not on occasion act by itself and without being put into action by a foreign power? There are, moreover, 1,000 cases in life where perfect equilibrium occurs. For example, when it comes to choosing between two louis d'or 48, which I am offered. If one dares to maintain seriously to me that I am necessitated, and that there is a reason in favour of the one I have taken, I for reply begin to laugh. So intimately persuaded am I that it is in my power to take one of the two louis d'or rather than the other, and that there is for that choice no prevailing reason, since those two coins are entirely alike, or appear so to me. From all we have said about freedom, we may conclude that its essence consists in the intelligence which envelops a distinct understanding of the object of deliberation, in the spontaneity with which we determine ourselves, and in the contingency, in other words, in the exclusion of logical or metaphysical necessity. The intelligence is like the soul of freedom, and the rest is like its body and base. Free substance determines itself alone, and that following the motive of the good perceived by the understanding which inclines it without necessitating it. If to these three conditions you add the indifference of equilibrium, you will have a definition of freedom as it is in men during this mortal life, and such as it has been defined as necessary by the Church to merit and demerit in the state of corrupted nature. This freedom excludes not only constraint, never was it allowed even by the fatalists, and physical, absolute and fatal necessity, neither the Calvinists nor the Jansenists have ever recognized it, but further moral necessity, whether absolute or relative. Catholic freedom is independent of any necessity, following this definition. Admerendum et demerendum in statu naturae lapsae, non requiritur in homine libertas a necessitate, Sed sufficit libertas a coactione. 50. This proposition having been condemned as heretical, and that in the sense of Jansenius we subscribe to the decision of the Church only insofar as we recognize a freedom exempt from the necessity to which Jansenius subjected it. Now this necessity is moral only, therefore to be a Catholic one must allow a freedom free of moral necessity, and consequently a freedom of indifference or equilibrium, which must not be understood in the sense that the will never inclines one way or the other. Such equilibrium is foolish and is gainsaid by experience, but rather in the sense that the will dominates its penchants. Yet it does not dominate them so much that we are always directly the masters of our volitions. The power of the soul over its inclinations is often an authority that can be exerted only indirectly, somewhat as Bellarmino would have it that the popes too should have rights over the temporal power of kings. 51. In truth, external acts that do not surpass our strength depend absolutely on our will. But our volitions depend on the will only by certain deft detours which give us the means of suspending or changing our resolutions. We are the masters of our house, not as God is in the world, but as a wise prince is in his estates, or as a good paterfamilias is in his household. 52.